All right, we'll go ahead and get started now. I wanted to welcome everyone to our next in the series that we have a voter education series where we explore topics and issues that Alabama is facing to basically help voters understand the issues and why voting matters. And so this topic tonight is looking at the report that the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama published recently. We'll hand this off to Stephanie Butler, the treasurer of the League of Women Voters of Alabama. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Kathy Jones, president of the League of Women Voters of Alabama. And Stephanie, and we'll hand it off to you and let you carry it from here.
Thank you, Kathy. So nice to see all of y'all. Thank you very much for joining us. I see a lot of friends here and also some new friends that I met last night at an amazing postcard writing campaign, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this event, but I want to get to the main event here. First, I want to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Thomas Spencer, and he is a senior research associate at the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama. He's got a diverse background in research and journalism, writing on a wide variety of topics, including environment, education, economics, governmental and community affairs, politics, and civil rights. Thank you, Tom, for being with us. We also have Dr. Mitchell Brown. She's the Curtis O. Liles III Professor in the Department of Political Science at Auburn University. She is a founding editor of the Journal of Election Administration Research and Practice, and she currently co-directs the Election Administration Initiative and serves as curricular faculty for the National Association of Election Officials. And we also have with us today Christopher Tyler Burks. He is a visiting assistant professor at Samford University. He serves on the Birmingham Planning Commission and is president of the Alabama chapter of the American Society for Public Administration. He founded Urban Analysis, a consulting firm for change-making through policy, planning, and politics, and he's a member of the board of Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform. Thank you all so very much for being here with us. We really appreciate you. I want to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit about the incredible institutions that you're a part of. I know about them, but a lot of the people here on this meeting might not. So one at a time, tell me a little bit about your organization and the work that you do. And Mitchell, can we start with you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm a faculty member in the political science department at Auburn. We have a graduate program in election administration that's connected to our Master of Public Administration program. And for the last 35 years, the faculty at Auburn have served as the curricular faculty for the Election Center's CIRA certificate, which is the only national certification program for election officials in the country.
Thank you. Chris, tell us a little bit about your work and also some background on the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Stephanie. So I serve on the board of the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform, which commissioned this report and others to come from the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama. We believe it's really important to find ways to communicate to our citizens in Alabama about how the Constitution impacts their well-being. And so this is the first of many reports to come focusing fundamentally on democratic accountability in our political systems. So we're grateful for Thomas Spencer and others that worked on this. As you mentioned, I've served as a visiting assistant professor of political science at Samford over the past year. I'm now an incoming assistant professor of public administration at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you. And Tom, give the audience an overview of PARCA and what it does.
Okay. Well, PARCA was founded in 1987 by former Governor Albert Brewer, who was on the law school faculty there at Cumberland, Samford University's law school, along with Thomas Courts, who was the president then at Samford, and a kind of a cadre of businessmen and women from around the state who saw the need for unbiased, nonpartisan public information that could be shared with the legislature. It was Governor Brewer's and other policymakers it was Governor Brewer's experience that Alabama's political process was heavily influenced by lobbyists who were paid to represent their own point of view, and you didn't have a big staff, so serving the legislature. And so PARCA is kind of envisioned as a provider of that kind of objective research. And it's supported by members statewide and businesses. And then we also do contract work, helping school systems understand their data. We do a lot of work in data analysis, and working with state and local government agencies to identify best practices, and do these kind of deep dive issues, issue papers like the one we're talking about tonight. I mentioned Governor Brewer and Thomas Courts. They were both founding members, along with Bailey Thompson and others, of the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform. And so there's been a significant overlap between our supporters and our founders and the organization Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform. And of course, PARCA has spent a lot of time over the years researching issues related to the Constitution, and has written about the need to reform it, and, from a good government standpoint. So, we believe government can work and needs to work, and is a necessary part of society, and that we can continuously improve it through thoughtful research and information exchange.
So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about your latest report, which was a partnership between the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform and PARCA, and what makes election administration, election policy, and voting policy so complicated is that, our federalist framework, states have great autonomy. People use Justice Brandeis's phrasing that states are laboratories of democracy. So part of the autonomy is that every state determines how to run its own elections, and that includes federal elections. So sticking with the metaphor of laboratories, we should also be able to use data to test the level of success or failure of experiments in each state. And that's what we're here to talk about. You guys went really in depth into this. Why did y'all decide to study election policies, and why now?
Well, we were, going back to speaking about the Alabama ACCR, challenged us to think about the Constitution. In 2022, we, at least in name, adopted a new Constitution, a recompiled version of the Alabama Constitution of 1901, and that came after years of effort by ACCR and others to correct some of the problems with the original document that is the world's longest constitutional document, very complex, designed for an agrarian era, and really the fundamental purpose of the and so we made some corrections and made some changes that make it a little bit easier to understand, but we were kind of challenged to think about what have we fixed and what haven't we fixed. And as we were launching into this process, we first kind of thought about, so what was the origin and purpose of the 1901 Constitution? What was the primary motivating factor for adopting it? And it is very clear this is not critical race theory, because you can read the opening statements in the convention, and they very explicitly say it's to disenfranchise Blacks and to secure white supremacy which was supposedly under threat from maybe a coalition. If Blacks were joined in league with Union organizers, as they had 10 years previous, then perhaps they would have the political power and clout to gain the right to vote, to expand the franchise and have a hand in running the government. And this was seen as a threat to white supremacy. So have we changed as a state, as far as that goes? Have we changed the constitutional architecture of our approach to voting rights? It seemed like a fundamental question in an election year when talk of democracy was, and kind of the fundamental questions of democracy seemed to be kind of on the table this year. And so we kind of delved into it. And as early, in 1996, I believe, we did revise the suffrage article and removed a lot of the language that specifically, or at least amended a lot of language that specifically barred, created a bunch of obstacles to registering to vote and participating in voting, and adopted, some more pro-voting language. But even as late as 2022, we were still kind of editing the document and finding poll taxes still being mentioned, for instance. A lot of those provisions were struck down in the 60s and were as unconstitutional. So they were null and void. They weren't in practice, but they were still there as relics in the Constitution. Those had been mostly removed, and so in reading the 2022 Constitution, you don't find prohibitions to voting. Though it's interesting to me that the document still, as written now, refers to voting as a privilege, not a right. And we had adopted an amendment. It was there was a worry among some that immigrants were going to vote in Alabama elections. And so instead of saying, I believe the original language was something like, all citizens have the right to vote in Alabama, it became only citizens of the United States can register to vote. And so the language changed, and it had a familiar ring. Not that the people who were advocating for this and voted for this, the majority of Alabamians, actively wanted to go back to the 1901 structure, but I would say that we are reflexively suspicious of our fellow citizens and want to make sure that only those people who we believe to be, we're nervous about democracy, I would say.
When they redid some of the Constitution in 2022 and over the years, they've been very specific about their language choices, and I think it's important, that we infer wisely from that. Chris, talk a little bit about ACCR's interest in this topic, and since Tom brought it up, if you want to talk about y'all's journey through constitutional reform, including the 2022 recompilation. What y'all thought about that? Was it effective? Was it enough?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So I'd love to build on that. I'm grateful to see many of my fellow board members of the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform on this call. So Gerald Johnson, one of our members, really instigated this partnership with PARCA to develop these reports to more explicitly help citizens understand how the Constitution impacts their well-being. And so ACCR was formed about in the year 2000, the foundation, and has since done a lot of work elevating the issue, increasing awareness of the Constitution. Surprisingly, many Americans are not aware that their state even has a constitution, right? So just increasing the political awareness that there's this document that has a great impact on your life. Well, as he reflected, he wondered, what progress has been made since ACCR was founded, and while much awareness has been improved, change is slow coming, right? Constitution is a fundamental law. It's the most difficult law to change. And so as I spoke to him about this, he, went about asking, what has been done? How can we be more successful in our mission to reform the Constitution? And the answer he heard from others, and I'm quoting from his email, is that we've never shown convincingly and explicitly how the Alabama Constitution impacts the daily lives of Alabama citizens. And so that's the goal of these projects in this report, is to help this be more explicit for Alabama citizens to understand how they're governed and how that governance impacts their life. So we've set up this first report dealing with the fundamental fact of how do we hold power accountable through democracy. Of course, none of the other policy areas, the things that we do, are going to matter unless we can hold power accountable. And so we start here with democracy. But we also look forward to reports on the economy, including transportation and communication, on education, the environment, healthcare, particularly the issue of expanding Medicaid, liberty, and safety and security. So I want to invite everyone listening to support this work, this excellent work that PARCA is doing on behalf of the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform. We are financially supporting this effort. We invite you to join us in supporting that through constitutionalreform.org, where you can make a contribution to this effort. Thanks.
I really appreciate you framing that, because a lot of the conversation is just Constitution bad, but specifically how is really important, so that we can begin to advocate for specific issues and to learn how some of the poor choices and poor language in the Constitution impacts very specific policies. So thank you for framing that. I don't want to get too deep into history, but context is important here. When I was looking at the nationwide maps on PARCA's report website, I noticed that a lot of the positive indicators tended to be low across the Southeast, and the negative indicators tended to be high across the Southeast. Mitchell, why do Southern states traditionally tend to perform so poorly on election participation and policy measures?
Yeah, so Southern states tend to have slightly lower participation rates, and in some cases really lower participation rates than other parts of the country. This can be attributed to a lot of different things. There's a real tendency among Southern states to not want to deviate from the way things have been traditionally done. And there's a political culture. There's a political sociologist named Elgar who liked to refer to Southern states as having traditionalistic political culture, where things are very patriarchal and top down. And you don't see in those kinds of states a lot of change and a lot of innovation. There are other factors, though, that are involved as well. There are pressures to get to innovation in the election administration field specifically. You end up with population pressures on the system in some places that explains change. We don't have much political competition when it comes to top-level statewide offices and national offices, and we know that not having much competition then makes the campaigns less interesting, and so you're going to get fewer people who are interested in participation. And then you get the long-term effects of years of voter suppression, but that was 60 years ago when the federal government started stepping in and changing that, and so it's hard to tie those things specifically to the behaviors of people today, though you can trace some of that at the individual level back.
Still muted, Steph.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question, Chris. A lot of times when we talk about the history of this, Mitchell brought up from 60 years ago forward, the conversation is really focused around the participation rates and the impacts of policies on African American voters. Is this tendency in the South to restrict ballot access really about Black voters, or is there a broader impact we need to be thinking about?
Well, it's absolutely both about Black voters and class in general. And so when you go back and look at, as Tom pointed out to us, the Constitutional Convention that gave us the 1901 Constitution that we are now dealing with even through a recompilated version, Knox, who chaired that convention, said outright, how can we, not through force, not through fraud, which they had been using to control power in Alabama, violence and fraud, how can we just legally set up the game in such a way that only those who are already in power, white men with property, can maintain that power? How can we secure white supremacy, he said, in fact, point blank. And so the Constitution of 1901 was set up both to disfranchise Black people and poor white people through instruments like the poll tax, and literacy tests, and other arbitrary means of excluding people from democracy.
So I've got all these historical issues, a lot of these challenges still with us today. And I actually pulled that bit out of the 2022 Constitution that you mentioned earlier, Tom, where they describe voting not as a right, but very specifically as a privilege. And for the League and so many other organizations here tonight that work in this space, we really feel that in the way our elected officials make and enforce election law in the state. So before we get into all the details in the report, I want to ask Mitchell and then Tom, what's your overall impression of the state of election systems in Alabama? Give us a grade. Mitchell, you're a teacher. Give us a grade.
Well, I would guess some of my panelists would disagree with me, but I think we're in the B plus, A minus range. We have pretty high levels of voter registration in the state, no matter how you measure what voter registration is. And the attempts to, there's been a lot of language used about how the state runs elections and how the counties run elections, and to suggest that there's voter suppression because we don't do some of the things that other states do to make it easier for folks to vote. I would push back about that. I don't think it's voter suppression. I think having precinct day voting is not voter suppression. So we do precinct day voting, and we've not done mail voting, and we do have we don't have no excuse absentee voting. We have excuse-based absentee voting. It's possible to vote. It's possible to vote absentee. You don't have to. You don't have to be able to vote in your bathrobe to say you don't have voter suppression. And so I think we do a fine job. Could we be friendlier? Yeah, we probably could be. The way we do absentee voting specifically, I think, is overly complicated, but we're not engaged in active voter suppression in any definition of the term, as I understand it.
Well, and that's why we love having you, because you've just got that broad national perspective to compare us to how other people are doing it, and the technical pieces behind it, and what's really driving those decisions. So that's why we love having you. Tom, you want to give us a grade?
I would go more for C, but I'm not. I defer to Mitchell on her expertise on how stuff is actually carried out, and whether or not the greater accessibility measures are. I think in our kind of pre-conversation, and I've been thinking about this a little bit after having that conversation when we were kind of warming up for this panel. A lot of the things I identify in the report as measures like early, we're one of the 4 states that doesn't allow early voting. Or no excuse absentee voting, those allowing that would open up the convenience of voting to perhaps more people, and may increase our voter participation, but it does come with a cost. And as Mitchell pointed out, and in a state where we also make the choice, and we also are bound somewhat by our Constitution to fairly low revenues. Comparatively, our state and local taxes are generally 49th or 50th compared to the other states, on a per capita basis. So is it the most pressing expenditure to expand the days on which you can vote? I think, from my perspective, if we're historically if we had a history of excluding blacks and poor whites, and some of these measures that are still in place that we have not adopted, measures we have not adopted that would be more inclusive, and would make a shift worker better able to cast a vote, who would, somebody who's isn't sure about where they're going to be, they're driving, a truck driver, a disabled person. If we kind of have a historical cross to bear, I would say, in making our system more accessible, and that doesn't seem to be our habit, and so that's why I give us a C.
Fair. Well, let's talk about a little bit of the particulars and the data in your research. So the title of the report is How Alabama Democracy Compares. You can see the full report on PARCA. You can see all the Tableau data. They got great charts and graphs. I definitely recommend going there and checking it out. So what are Alabama's participation numbers, and how does our turnout compare to other states? Are we doing good, bad, average?
Lower than most states, particularly in off presidential years. As Mitchell mentioned before, we don't have a lot of partisan competition, and so particularly that general election, when the statewide officials are basically predetermined and your local officials are basically predetermined by who won the primary. You don't have a lot of enthusiasm to go out to the polls, and so we were in the bottom 5 at least in the last election in terms of voter participation, and it's been interesting to watch. It's kind of since 2012, since we kind of lost. The Democratic, the Republicans gained ascendancy, a supermajority in the legislature, just perhaps coincidentally, perhaps as a function of less partisan competition. You have seen that divergence from national averages as Alabama has sunk lower in voter participation in general elections and the off-year elections. So I think that's what you asked. And if you want to go through other measures, we can do that too. So,
well, I mean, you mentioned low competitiveness, and I was wondering, Mitchell, can you offer any thoughts on how we got to a place where so many races in Alabama are just not competitive? And does this fall into the category of a policy problem that can be fixed or worked on?
Well, it certainly has policy implications, right? Because when you have these low competitive races, because you have a state where one party is strongly favored to win over another, it's got obvious policy implications. I will say this is a little bit of a digression from what you asked, but one of the true ironies to me in the current conversation about what our election laws are, and this idea that Republicans and conservatives tend to be strict constructionists and want to keep with the traditions of the founders and not change things. To that extent, the state legislature ought right now to start early voting, because we used to have voting periods. You used to have multiple days of voting because transportation was difficult. And it's only when transportation got easy that you saw states move away from that. And so to the extent that we've got a a legislature that's full of a bunch of strict constructionists, they should absolutely go back to early voting right now.
Let me get to my
I'd
early
just
vote.
like to add to that, one of the interesting things I came across in the research was that, prior to 2016 or so, it's really Republicans and rural voters who took advantage of early voting and to a greater extent than the Democratic base. A lot of those rural states out west are very spread out and sprawling, and kind of recognize the conditions that Mitchell was just talking about. And you basically have a voting period because it's hard to get all the way to the county seat to vote, or your precincts are so spread out and sparse that it makes sense to extend that time period. And just kind of relating back to our political culture, the West was populated by a lot of new settlers who didn't know each other, and they had to invest in. They tended to be invest in organizations and structures, invest their time in developing institutions, and also kind of trusted more of the process. The progressive era adopted initiative and referendum, this kind of idea that the citizens could participate. Here, we were already established. We had the kind of the black-white denomination, and I think it continues to this day. Our politics is more relational, and it's who you know, and I think the more and more we kind of draw tighter bounds around gerrymandering and so forth, and making predictable districts that will elect kind of a predictable outcome, the less we have engagement, which is kind of what Mitchell was talking about, that restricts our policy choices. So some of the ideas, one of the things that is mentioned, we do not, any change to the Alabama Constitution has to go through the Alabama legislature. And so we do not have the ability to petition the government and put an initiative on the ballot, or call a referendum and so forth. That's available in a lot of states, particularly out west, even some in the southeast. And you've seen citizens use that in the last several years, as far back as it's been used for conservative causes to limit taxes. Proposition 13's famous California, property tax restrictions. Colorado also adopted a similar revenue restriction through an initiative and referendum. But more recently, having citizens have the ability to vote on the expansion of Medicaid, on reproductive rights and so forth, having all the citizens that being able to vote gets it out of this kind of partisan party structure that is less likely to put that question in front of the people. So I think that's kind of an interesting factor in the way we've set things up.
And I read in your report that there was polling on questions like officials in Montgomery do not care what people like me think, and people like me have no say in what the government in Montgomery does. These were not very positive outcomes that we saw in these survey questions. And in some ways, Alabama's elected officials really are insulated from interference from the citizens of the state, because we don't have citizen-led initiatives and can't call for a recall of an elected politician. Chris, what do you think led to, why don't we have these direct democracy options in Alabama? How do you think we ended up here?
Well, we've never had it, right? So There was never a force to implement it. As Americans expanded to the West, as Tom was reminding us, they innovated new institutions. And in the process of creating new institutions, formed new traditions, such as the referendum, which allows the everyday citizen to compile signatures, to take a initiative to a statewide ballot, to have the people decide on the matter. That was not a part of any of the eastern states. And so when the frontier was at the Alabama stage, that was not even an option. No one had innovated it yet. But as we moved west, other states adopted it.
And I want to get back to your comment, Mitchell, about that we should do early voting. And we did talk about this a little bit in the preliminary call, that, the former Secretary of State, John Merrill, he said that the cost would be significant and that the number of people who would turn out or had turned out to take advantage of early voting was really small. Can Alabama afford it? I mean, is his position that it's very expensive and it's not worth the effort? Is that valid?
It's actually a very valid point. My point was just to avoid being a hypocrite in the legislature. It's actually that there's a real balance. There are a lot of different things we could do to innovate in elections to make it easier for everybody to vote. And we don't do all of them, and most states don't do all of them, because when you have multiple paths into voting, it requires a greater election administration infrastructure, and that requires dollars, and most election offices are funded locally. And so it's not that the states or the federal government is providing this money. Most of the money for elections come from local coffers and local tax base. And so there is an efficiency, a good government calculation that has to be made about if you're in a place where you've got limited tax dollars, how are you going to spend it? We see this in states with really long early voting periods that, especially with a lot of places for early voting to do this, then that they don't get quite as much use of it to justify the expenses they have. We'd also have to change completely the kind of equipment we use to do it, right? If we were going to go to early voting, we'd need to have vote centers. So we would have to have machines that are ballot on demand machines, and they're not cheap, and they require also a fair amount of administrative expertise. And so we've chosen not to spend our money that way. And it is as you think about this sort of push and pull between access, between integrity, and being good stewards of public money, there are concessions that have to be made.
And I'll just let me throw in, when we had this discussion before, Mitchell also pointed out rightly that the initiative and referendum process, it can also be a real nightmare, and very, very expensive, and often hijacked by moneyed interests. And so despite pointing that out with some passion, I have to our inability to have it, there are certainly drawbacks. So
Yeah, I mean, for all the things that we don't have in Alabama, we only think of what are we missing out on. We don't look at the other side. What are the unintended consequences? So it does help to look at other states and what struggles do they have. I wanted to also ask about absentee voting, which came up. There's 36 states that don't require voters to provide an excuse for absentee voting, but in Alabama, it's a very narrow set of circumstances in which a voter is supposed to be allowed to request an absentee ballot. Now, the league and our partner and organizations, we do a lot of complaining about Alabama's absentee voting process, saying it's really complicated. Mitchell, is it really more complicated to vote absentee in Alabama compared to other states, or are we just hanging out with everybody else?
It's actually more complicated, and it's one of the reasons I gave a possible B plus rating, because the absentee balloting process in the state is hard, and it is harder than in a lot of other places. And there are a lot of reasons that drive what we do. There are the steps that you have to go through. And when you overlay that with the way that we underfund the postal system and the changes that we've made to the postal system, it makes it a real challenge. I do a lot of election observations all over the country. In 2022, I tried to get an absentee ballot, and I needed it sent to me out of state, and I thought I had enough time, and I didn't have enough time, so I didn't get to vote in 2022, and I was pretty mad. I did vote. I was doing election observations out of town when we had our primary this year, and I learned my lesson and I started really early this time, but even that process was challenging. Where I was, I didn't know two people um, to sign it, and so I had to get it notarized, which is kind of crazy. We're allowed to use the affidavit and our signature and our attestation, right, to register to vote. We probably ought to be allowed to do that to vote absentee as well. So I'd say that one's a problem. And I get the other side of the argument that what we're trying to do is to prevent voter fraud, but I don't think the numbers justify the real hard process that we make people go through in the state.
Tom or Chris, do either of you want to discuss anything about absentee ballots or the legitimate or not legitimate claim of fraud? I mean, is this a real issue that we need to be concerned about?
Well, I'll just echo what Dr. Brown has mentioned, that this has not been proven to be a problem. It's a problem in rhetoric. It's mentioned many times by politicians, but it's not been proven empirically to be a problem. As in, no elections are being overturned by fraudulent elections.
No, we do have a certain history of, a scattered number of prosecutions. Particularly local elections are easier to influence in that way, and I think there are even some under contest right now. So it's not totally beyond the pale, but there, as Mitchell mentioned, there are ways to deal with that. I mean, security of the ballot is an important virtue, and we need to protect it. But making it very hard to vote absentee, we do make it too hard, I think. I have to admit and confess, sadly enough, that I missed voting for my state we had a special election for a state representative yesterday. Was that Tuesday? And I had intended to vote. I knew who I was going to vote for, and with the lack of media coverage, the kind of the different way we get information or don't get information now, I totally forgot that the runoff was yesterday, and I really wish I'd had the option of an early vote, because I would have gone the day after the primary and cast my vote. So anyway.
I want to move on to something else in the report. It was about the cost of voting. And it says that the cost of voting in Alabama is among the highest in the country at 46 out of the 50 states. Chris, what does that mean? How does the average voter feel the cost to vote?
So cost is a broad term, not just thinking about economics and dollars spent, but the time it takes to understand the electoral process, who's on the ballot, what do they represent, the time it takes to get somewhere, to do these things. Following up on the discussion about absentee voting, the trend in America is to have more early voting and voting by mail, and we're at the tail end of that. We have not adopted these measures to enable access to democracy for Alabamians. And so we're really falling behind in giving our citizens opportunity to participate and hold power accountable in our state.
And we also have issues with voter registration. Mitchell, Alabama has made some progress in this area over the last decade or so. Can you tell us some of the positives? What are some things that Alabama is doing well?
Yeah, in response to a lot of the pushback about when Alabama passed the voter ID law, there was a concerted effort by the Secretary of State's office to do a lot of outreach to people. The state actually has a really long list compared to other states of what kind of valid IDs we take. So you can register to vote. You can use your concealed carry permit. It's crazy to me the number of people who have them, and your college IDs count. So when we compare Alabama to a lot of other states that have voter ID laws, we actually allow a lot more greater breadth of types of ID. The state also spent a lot of money and a lot of time going around and doing mobile ID specific to the voter registration process, so people without IDs could have a specific voter ID. That caused some other kinds of problems. One of the things that we saw was a lot of people trying to get those IDs to use them to do other things, like to find work. But the state gives them and they don't ask a question. If you're registering to vote and you don't have a valid form of ID and you sign the affidavit, you can get one of those cards. And so in that way, it's a good government story.
Before we get too much farther into the topic of voter registration, I do want to address Secretary of State Allen's comments about PARCA's data. The Secretary, Tom, he's insisted that the voter registration data used in the PARCA report is just wrong. Secretary Allen and Secretary Merrill before him, they both insisted that voter registration rates were in the high 90s. How do you square their numbers with the voter registration data PARCA used?
So our data was not, our data came from the Census Bureau, and it was based on census survey. I don't, surveys are inherently have a margin of error, and we don't really know, survey, and they're biased responses and so forth. So I wouldn't swear that the data we used is exactly, representative precisely of the voter registration in Alabama. However, it is a uniform way across the states of gathering this information and being able to provide a comparison, which is why we used it. Using the data that they advocate using is inherently flawed in that they actually base their base population numbers on census estimates of population that are not that are updated, but they're also prone to error. They enumerate, different states will purge their voter rolls at different times. And so the numerator is also kind of fluctuating up and down. And so to get an apples to apples comparison, we chose to use the census data, which shows a much lower percentage of voters registered. We're, I believe, around what did we say, 67%. Voter registration. That actually does sound a little low to me, but I also think 97% is higher than it would be credible. It's very hard to imagine. And some of the states and counties are listed in their data sources, in the data sources they point to, as having a 102% voter registration. So it's kind of strains credulity to use those. So that's my answer.
Stephanie, can I jump in on this? So registration and turnout rates are notoriously hard to sort out. And they're hard to sort out for two reasons. That is because there are different numerators and different denominators that can be used. On the denominator side, you can have the voting age population, but depending on the state that you're in, some portion of that population isn't actually eligible. And so it artificially changes the proportion, right? So then some people use the voting eligible population and as the denominator. On the numerator side, to what Tom was discussing, you can have different sources of information about that. So you've got the state reports and the EVES data, which is data that are reported from each of the states that they draw up from the counties and give to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission every 2 years after a national election. Or you can use things like the CPS and the ACS that Tom's referring to. The problem with those data is they are based off of people's self-report. And self-report has two different problems that actually go in opposite directions. One of those problems we refer to as social desirability bias. So oftentimes people over-report doing things like voting because it's expected to do, right? Whereas they underreport things like I don't drink and drive, right? Because that's something that's shunned in society. On the other hand, people have notoriously bad memories and are influenced by whatever they're thinking about when the survey is done. And so any kind of retrospective kinds of questions are also questionable. And so one of the problems, and to get to the apples to apples comparison that Tom was just addressing, is that different studies use different numerators and they use different denominators, and it causes a problem in making comparisons over time.
But it is useful to making comparisons state to state as long as you're using the same data set and comparing at a moment.
And you presume that, ceteris paribus exists in your data collection process. Right?
Got it. Well, let's talk about some of these voter registration strategies. We've got automatic voter registration, which is a thing in 24 states and Washington, D.C. And that's what triggers when someone applies for a government license or interacts with the government for a service. Now, Alabama makes applications available, but it doesn't provide automatic registration. So, Chris, Alabama has this opt-in strategy for voter registration, but in some states, citizens are automatically opted in when they interact with the government, and if they don't want to, they can opt out. Can you tell me about some of the pluses and minuses of each way of doing it?
Yeah, this builds on your previous question about the costs of voting, right? So we can reduce the cost of voting by having automatic voter registration, as several states have accommodated. What this means is when you interact, for example, with the DMV to get your driver's license, you don't have to do this extra step of opting in to register to vote. That interaction, all the information that you've given the government that's needed for registration is already applied, and you are automatically registered and ready to participate. So in public administration, we talk about administrative burdens. And this is one of the ways that we change how many people are going to participate in democracy. Is there layers of bureaucratic burdens that a person has to navigate, learn, go do, attend a particular place, fill out a particular form, get it in by a particular date? Or does the state want you to participate and going to make it easy for you by getting you automatically registered? Now, you can always opt out of these. None of these states that have brought in automatic voter registration are forcing people to be on a registrar. You can opt out of it. But this has shown to demonstrate an improvement or an increase in participation in elections through automatic voter registration, whereas the administrative burden of not having that has reduced our participation in democracy.
So if it increases participation and it reduces administrative burden and it reduces costs, Tom or Mitchell, can you guys weigh in on why the state would not do that? Automatic voter registration?
Well, the first thing to know is that DMVs are not actually allowed to register people to vote. What they do is they collect the information and it gets sent to voter registrars to verify and then register people to vote. And so people hear that, oh, you just need to go to the DMV and you can register and you're done. That's not actually true. There is a transfer of information, and the question is whether that transfer of information is automatic. And so it's an important step there that people miss a lot. And while it's nuanced, it's actually quite important. Now, why might we not want to do that? I think those are probably political questions, right?
Well, but I do think we have to be aware of that there are unintended consequences. While we say it decreases administrative burden, it actually there are ways in which it increases the work of the registrars to have to verify is this a new registration? Is this a valid registration? And so in some cases, people mistakenly, who are not necessarily eligible to vote, register, not really knowing, and so that's it does create some issues. So the automatic voting is not universally an unmitigated good, I believe.
Yeah, so let me jump in on that. One of the consequences of NVRA is that all of those public-facing human service agencies, when NVRA was passed in '93, were tasked with giving people voter registration forms. And when we think about the unintended policy consequences that happen, NVRA was supposed to, the idea was we want more people to participate. Registration is a barrier. How do we lower that barrier? And well, we need multiple pathways in. Some people refer sometimes to government doing things like this as no wrong door, right? So every human service interagency of the government that you might connect with, you can get a voter registration form and they'll send it to the registrar for you if you just filled it out. One of the downsides to that is that it's created a huge burden for the registrars because people just automatically fill out forms and they do it without thinking about what they're filling out because they're at a government agency and they're given a whole bunch of forms to fill out. And so you end up getting people who register over and over and over again, who sometimes give different information each time, and the registrars then have to spend time to try and figure out what's the right thing and go back to somebody who's already registered and say, hey, but do you mean to re-register? Do you mean to do this? And another unintended consequence of this is that sometimes people who aren't eligible to vote get these forms and they're given these forms and they think they need to fill them out, and then they get targeted and they become the subject of people going after them saying you're not allowed to vote but you tried to. That's fraud, right? And so we then go after and we prosecute people who really weren't intentionally trying to do something wrong, and that's a problem.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And another way that other states get people into the system is things like Election Day voter registration, which the Alabama legislature and the Secretary of State have been adamantly against. Currently in Alabama, voters have to be registered by the 15th day prior to the election. And I mean, I have a feeling if we ask you, Mitchell, you'll be able to explain the logistical hurdles of same day voter registration. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, you have to be able to verify that the person, if you're doing same day voter registration, that the person is actually eligible, that they're in that district, that they don't have an active voter registration somewhere else that needs to be canceled. And so it's possible to do that, but again, it requires money and attention that we've not been willing to invest in the system.
And let me ask you one more question, then I'll pick on somebody else. And it's a little bit off script, but when you and I talk, I hear you talk about it, and I think it's important to inform our listeners. When organizations like the League of Women Voters are trying to put out statewide guidance on elections processes, and like very simple things like who to contact with voter registration and voting questions in each county, we find it really difficult to give one size fits all information for, statewide. Can you explain what's behind that? And is this normal in all states?
Yeah, it varies from state to state, but historically, voting and how election administration is structured was very much a bottom-up thing. And so election offices started at the county or at the city level, and we've had more and more structure imposed on election offices across states over the last 60 years. But in some states are top down, and so everything's done in the exact same way in the exact same place. But because election offices are funded locally and they're structured locally, every office, every county in the state has to follow the same state laws. But what that looks like in practice, there's sometimes variation in that. However, I will say that the state's done a very good job of having an active website that when you have questions will point you to the right person to call and the right office to call. So
now, before we get to some of the other things, thank you for that, because it always helps me to hear from you when you talk about that stuff. Before we get to more of the intricate stuff about elections, I wanted to get back to a question about voter participation rates. I'm going to direct this one to you, Chris. In the PARCA report, it said that 27% of people surveyed said they didn't vote because they were too busy, conflicting work, or school schedule. 17.6% said they were not interested, felt my vote wouldn't make a difference. Now, some people might argue that we can't make people care, and we can't make people make voting a priority. I'm wondering, how do you answer that? I mean, how is voter turnout a public policy issue if everyone really has an equal opportunity to participate in elections?
So, I'm sorry, could you restate it for me?
There are people who gave a lot of reasons, and it really just had to do with convenience. They're busy, and that equaled about 40% of the people who they were just too busy, conflicting work scheduled, not interested. And I'm wondering, how do you make this a public policy issue? This is just people's approach and perspective on voting. It's just not a priority for a lot of people.
Yeah, so there's a big disconnect in our political culture, and there's a lot of people in leadership who are not interested in elevating the rates of participation in democracy. In society, we've got basically two big power bases. There's money and there's the vote. Money gets people elected. Voting can take them out of office. If there's less people participating in democracy, money's power over democracy is elevated. We've got this expression about the big mules in Alabama. The big mules being powerful interests, own property, who have stood at the top of traditional hierarchies of race and class. How are they going to be held accountable? If they can't be held accountable with money because they're the ones with it, then we're left with voting. But if voting is not elevated as a priority in our politics, then that power can't be held accountable. And so it's incumbent on us to increase accessibility to democracy. It absolutely costs money. It's absolutely administratively difficult to run a big election system for a state. But what's our priority here? Do we want to hold power accountable or not? Because it takes some investment, and then it takes increased participation. Of the stats you were reading, many people are not participating because of illness or disability. And so we could have a more fair election system by allowing them to automatically vote by mail or have early voting. But these are not routes that we've taken in Alabama.
And y'all discussed a little bit earlier, that it's kind of hard to make people prioritize it when they really just don't feel like their vote makes a difference. And we talked a little bit about the issue of gerrymandered districts, that in a lot of places, people's vote really doesn't make a difference. But one thing that we didn't mention that maybe you want to talk a little bit about, Chris, is straight ticket voting. What are your thoughts on straight ticket voting? Will you explain it to the people who are with us and then give us your thoughts?
Yes, straight ticket voting is having the button at the top of your ballot that says, I want to vote all Republican or all Democrat. And this reduces competitiveness in elections, as the report points out, reduces some cognitive effort of going through and looking at each contest to look at what do these people represent, what policies are they advocating. Of course, a lot of people end up voting straight ticket, whether that's an option in their state or not, about 80%, 70 to 80% across states, PARCA's report found. But that's still 20 to 30% who are not voting in a straight ticket manner. So it comes down to that question of competitiveness in elections. Do you want to hold people accountable or not? You need to have a more competitive system, and straight tickets reduces that.
I kind of wish we had like a poll set up already for everybody who's here with us today to find out how many people here voted all Democrat or all Republican the last time they had a vote. I think that would probably be very, very high. But it does make a difference to have to go through and think about your choices rather than just fill in one single bubble. I feel like it makes a difference.
On the other hand, there's an efficiency calculation here, right? If what you're going to do, if you're a low information voter and all you care about is party, why not? It makes the voting process go faster. I'm a high information voter. I've got 2 master's degree and a PhD, and I'm a political junkie. And sometimes I go and I look at the ballot and I have no idea who these people are. And for some of the lower level races, and I'm like, what? I didn't even know this was on here. Who are these people? And then on what basis are you making your decision? Well, is it party or if I'm really perplexed, maybe I'll say who has the most interesting name. That's who I want to pick. Now, most of the time, it's actually about who has a name that people recall, right? Which gets back to money and politics and incumbency and things like that. But I think I get it. I get it about the competition and straight ticket voting, but it doesn't bother me at all. If you don't want to vote that way, then don't bubble in the box.
Well, I'm also a political junkie, and I learned something new last time I went to vote. I didn't know there was a thing such as constable that we vote on.
You
We
didn't know
vote on
that?
crazy things.
Oh my gosh. That fills up a lot of the ballot here.
It does. All right. I've got a few wrap-up questions, and then just to let participants know, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, I think that Kathy and Judy have asked to put them in the chat. Is that correct, ladies?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So if you have any questions, we will try to get to some at the end. So they're pretty solid in their position on how they want to do things in Montgomery. And it feels a little fruitless to even try. So how do we even begin to move the needle? Mitchell, you do work across the country. What are some good and reasonable, good government strategies that might work in Alabama? And can you give Alabamians any advice on how to make progress on these issues?
Well, the best way to make progress on some of these issues is to be able to convince the people who are actually in charge of the rules, and that's your state legislators, that the reforms might actually benefit them. If there are reforms that might benefit them, and you can convince them of that, I bet you could make some progress there. And there are some of these reforms that we know would benefit them and that potentially could benefit everybody. I don't mean to be such a political cynic, but like the people holding the bag at the end of the day, it's not Wes Allen, it's not the local election officials, it's the state legislature, because they're the people who set those rules, and that's where you need to put your energy.
So Tom, what's the roadmap for what's ahead? You've done all this amazing work on elections issues, voting issues. What's ahead? Chris mentioned some issues, but what's next?
Hey, I'm a reporter. I don't know till tomorrow until I have a deadline. So no, we are definitely gearing up toward. I'm kind of forgetting sort of what I promised, but before the end of the year, there is going to be we traditionally do an Alabama taxes compare, how Alabama taxes and spends. And a lot of the way we raise revenue and how we spend revenue is dictated by the Alabama Constitution. And so we are definitely going to delve deeply into that using the latest survey data, comparing us to other states, and how we're different. And some of the issues we talked about today about not having money to invest in these voter systems flow from low revenue and caps on local revenue, and it's also a reflection of how we treat government in Alabama, and it's kind of oftentimes designed to fail almost. If you kind of get what you pay for, and which increases cynicism in the long run. So it's kind of a self-defeating process. But I wanted to just throw in that maybe the answer is more Schoolhouse Rock. I think that has not been on the airwaves for a while, and I grew up, in the early '70s watching cartoons, and I'm Just a Bill, and it was. We were in a new era, right? And the 18-year-olds had just gotten the vote, and it seemed to me, I thought it was a universal thing that we wanted everybody to vote, and that it was it was a civic virtue. And I hope we could rekindle that spirit somehow and figure out a way, past the idea that this is all, hardcore partisan kind of disagreement. I think just there should be a bipartisan agreement that we should encourage voting, and may the best ideas win.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, earlier, you rattled off a laundry list of things that you would like to see studied and some forward movement on, but what's ACCR's priorities? If you had to say, this is what we want to do next, what would it be?
Well, so the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform is advocating for a constitution that actually works for Alabamians. And that, as our topic and discussion has elevated tonight, involves allowing Alabamians to participate in ways that other Americans participate in their state democracies, through early voting, through mail-in ballots, without the administrative burdens of trying to get an absentee ballot under certain provisions. Going back to the originalist interpretation of allowing these multi-day voting, as was originally, as Dr. Brown pointed out, there's a lot of ways that we can increase participation, and ultimately that's what's got to happen if we're going to hold power accountable.
If we can have holidays for Jefferson Davis's birthday and Robert E. Lee's birthday, we could have an election day holiday, you would think.
100%.
Absolutely not. I've got to jump in here. Absolutely not. And the reason is because the people who need that are the people who'd end up having to work on those days in minimum wage jobs anyway. And the people who would get the day off are the people who can go in to vote right now as it is. I love the idea. It sounds great. It's as if we actually have days off in this country where there aren't people working minimum wage jobs 24 hours a day. And election day is a holiday. Yeah, no way. They still got to work at the McDonald's and at the Walmart, and even if it's a holiday.
Tom and Chris, tell us how people can stay connected with y'all's work. Do you take, do you take financial support if somebody wanted to offer it?
Constitutionalreform.org. We invite everyone to participate, get involved, fund this research on how the Constitution impacts our everyday lives.
And yes, we are a nonprofit and depend on member support, and we're at parcalabama.org. You can find this report posted on linked to through the front page of the website. There's also, if you happen to be doing a presentation and want to share some of this or download slides, we have a menu called Data Dashboard under which you can find data dashboards. You go to that page and go to an online version of the graphics, and it actually allows you to dive deeper into some of the statistics that are cited in the report, and visual maps of where there's automatic voting, where there's no excuse voting, et cetera. And so if you parcalabama.org.
All right, I will be back in a minute. So I'm not going too far, but Kathy and Judy have been collecting questions. I want to give them an opportunity to let us hear from the participants.
All right, I have I have some questions here, but I first of all wanted to point out one thing I dropped in the chat today was a statement that was signed by the Secretary of State along with other conservative secretaries of state, basically disavowing anything that we've been talking about tonight as far as early voting, no excuse absentee voting. There has been at least for the last several Secretary of States, there's a real push against having federal intervention in elections, which, being a Southerner born and bred, that just reeks of the old South, not wanting the federal government to come in. I don't know how we're going to get a solution to these problems without federal legislation, such as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And I was wondering what you guys think.
Well,
I guess I'll pass it to Mitchell first, since she's probably been looking at these.
yeah, and since I'm your Gadfly panelist tonight, I'll say that I love vote centers. I love ballot on demand machines. I love early voting. I'm sorry, but not surprised that they don't want that. And the feds should be involved when we violate the law, but there's a real argument to be made on a couple different points about not going to a federal voting system. We have embedded protections by having a heterogeneous process. And in terms of like sort of nationwide voter integrity and foreign actors getting into systems, having a heterogeneous process actually makes us safer. I am 100% sure of this. And the other reason to not go to a federal system is because some of the great innovations that we have been talking about tonight happened because states were allowed to figure out they had a problem, they wanted to do something better to support their people, and they figured out how to do it. And so it's a shame that we can't get to some of those things that make voting easier. It's a shame that we won't spend the money on it, but there are reasons not to go to a federal system.
So the next, I guess, I don't know if Tom or Christopher want to follow up on that, but I did have go ahead.
I want to just ask real quick though, I think one of the problems from 2020 was that we have such a heterogeneous system that there was a lot of dispute by people from different states as to what is a legitimate vote. And so it seems like there does need to be some work. I appreciate what you're saying about the laboratories of democracy and 90%, much more of the elections that we conduct are local elections. And so having the feds have too much to do with it would be counterproductive, and we revolt against that. But I don't know, some sort of rule setting for federal elections so we all kind of know the rules seems like it would be useful. But
Yeah. How about the fact that 2012 was when you started seeing, I know it was mentioned earlier about 2012 being the year when you started seeing things, democracy sliding more quickly. If I'm paraphrasing, but that happened to be the year when the Voting Rights Act was gutted in the Section 5 preclearance. Is that seems to be a connected, that's connected with the fact that Alabama has immediately jumped into a lot of voter suppression laws starting then that same year with the voter ID, which I think we've adapted to, but there have been a lot of laws that have passed in the last few years that appear to be purely targeted at managing who is able to vote in Alabama. And that has no federal oversight. I guess, Christopher, do you have an opinion on, that's not so much a question, but I wonder what you think of that as far as reinstating the Section 5?
Yeah, I think it's needed. So the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, required states who had a history of discrimination and who could access the ballot to get pre-clearance from the federal government to make sure that they're not discriminating and who can participate in democracy. And clearly we built the whole Constitution to uphold it. What happened in Alabama immediately following Shelby County v. Holder, which eliminated that Section 5 preclearance provision, is that Alabama instituted the voter ID requirement. And then, where do you get that voter ID from most voters? At your DMV. And they shut down DMVs. And where did they shut down those DMVs? The state shut down DMVs in predominantly black counties. Over 70% of the cases where they shut down DMVs were in majority black counties. That's exactly why we had the Voting Rights Act to begin with. So I thank you for elevating that issue. It is, I think, an example of voter suppression.
And I think the last question I had was, do you see a connection between democracy and the attacks on education and voting as far as the civic IQ of the students that will be coming out of public school, if they are not, if their ability to learn about the civics and government and the history of Alabama, do you see a connection between what we've been talking about tonight and the efforts to control what is being taught by our teachers? And I'll ask that to Thomas, I guess.
We're nonpartisan, so I don't. I believe that in good civics education, and I think there are teachers out there who are not going to be cowed by, that was a bill that was of a fashion. I think there are dangers to, if not limiting free speech and open discussion by enforcement, but creating a chilling effect. But I just don't see how anybody could teach Alabama history without dealing with the unpleasantness. It's just so fundamentally established as part of our story that I don't think you can get around it.
Thank you,
But,
Stephanie. That was all I had.
I really appreciate you all being here. Mitchell, it's really always wonderful to have you. I mean, I think you called yourself a gadfly, but I mean, you keep it very real, and you help us to gain perspective and look at things like unintended consequences, good government, unanticipated costs. I just genuinely appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, thank you for coming and representing the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform. You guys have a massive moonshot goal for a mission, and I appreciate that you keep steadily moving towards it. And thank you very much to PARCA and Tom for producing this report. It really helps to shine light onto what is going on in Alabama and helps to really give us a gauge about how we're doing compared to other states. So thank you very much for your hard work.
well, thank you for having us. And thanks for the to the League of Women Voters for the work you do. And I was talking about Schoolhouse Rock earlier, and the kind of the Hall of Justice kind of characters that and organizations that grew up around voting and so forth. And I've always very much respected the League for being part of that. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And I'm going to use that opportunity to push one of our projects that we're working on right now. We have an immediate mission to send 27,000 postcards out to every registered Black voter in the 11 rural counties of Alabama's 2nd Congressional District. Sounds impossible, but in 2 weeks, we've already covered 3 full counties. So if you would like to help, we would love to have you. I'll shut up and drop the link to help with that project in the chat while Kathy closes us out. Thank you all again for being here.